The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your skin and makes the air feel thick. Inside the dimly lit corridors of the morgue, the cold metal tables stood in eerie stillness, their surfaces gleaming under the flickering fluorescent light. The faint hum of a refrigerator echoed through the empty halls, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps, small, hesitant, and completely out of place. A boy, no older than 7, moved cautiously through the shadows. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might give him away. His tiny hands, trembling yet determined, clutched a small glass vial. Inside, a strange liquid shimmered under the dim light, swirling like liquid gold. He didn't know exactly what it was, only that it was important, only that it might change everything. Just hours ago, he had stood beside his mother, watching as doctors shook their heads, offering quiet condolences that meant nothing to him. His world had crumbled in an instant. One moment, he had been holding the warm, familiar hand of his dearest person, and the next, it was slipping away, cold and lifeless. He refused to accept it. He refused to believe that death was final. His grandmother had once told him stories of ancient remedies, whispers of things beyond science, secrets that the world had forgotten. Desperate, he had listened, and when she had pressed the tiny vial into his hands, her wrinkled fingers curling around his own, she had said just 3 words, 3 drops only. Now, standing before the cold, lifeless body, he hesitated. His breath was uneven, his fingers clenched around the vial so tightly his knuckles turned white. The fluorescent lights buzzed, their weak glow making everything look unreal. The boy swallowed hard and leaned forward, his tiny fingers working to remove the cork. The scent was strange, earthy, metallic, something he couldn't quite place. He lifted the vial over the motionless chest, his hands shaking as he let the first drop fall. The liquid spread across the pale skin like ink on paper, vanishing as if the body had absorbed it. His heart pounded harder. He released the second drop. This time, something strange happened. The air around him shifted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. One more. Just one more. His fingers trembled as he tilted the vial for the final drop. As soon as it landed, a chill ran down his spine. The air felt heavier. The silence grew deeper. His breath hitched as he stepped back, his small chest rising and falling with each frantic gasp. And then, a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible gasp. The boy froze. His eyes widened. The body on the table twitched. Something had changed. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't alone in the room anymore. This cliffhanger leaves the audience eager to know what happens next, while keeping the tone suspenseful and emotionally engaging. Would you like any refinements? The boy's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides as he stared at the body on the cold metal table. The twitching had stopped, but something in the air felt different now. It was thicker, heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching him from every shadow in the room. For a long moment, nothing happened. The lifeless body remained still, pale, unmoving. Doubt began to creep into the boy's mind. Had he imagined it? Had his desperation tricked him into seeing something that wasn't real? His grandmother's words echoed in his head, 3 drops only. But why? What would happen if? A sudden, sharp breath sliced through the silence. The boy stumbled back, his small hands gripping the edge of a metal tray to keep himself from falling. His heart slammed against his ribs as he watched, wide-eyed, the impossible unfold before him. Fingers twitched. A chest that had been still only moments ago now rose and fell, shallow but steady. Then the eyelids fluttered. A noise, a rasping, strained sound, escaped the lips of the once lifeless figure. The boy's pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He had come here with hope, but now that it was happening, now that something was changing, a different emotion was creeping in. Fear. Then, very slowly, the eyes opened. For a split second, relief flooded through the boy. It worked. His mind screamed it over and over. It worked, but the relief didn't last long. The eyes that stared back at him weren't the same as before. Something was wrong. The gaze was distant, unfocused, like someone waking from a deep sleep. The boy whispered a name, his voice barely above a breath. No response. He tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. The figure's lips parted as if trying to speak, but no words came. Only a sound, low, raw, something between a sigh and a groan. The boy took a hesitant step forward, his small hands reaching out. Then, all at once, the body convulsed. A choked gasp, a shuddering breath. Then the sound of metal clattering as the body jerked violently, hands grasping at nothing, feet kicking against the table. The boy staggered backward, terror freezing him in place. The fluorescent lights above flickered wildly, the entire room seeming to shift around him. The once lifeless body sat up with a sudden, unnatural jolt, its head snapping toward him. The boy's breath hitched. Those eyes. They weren't the same eyes he had known, the ones filled with warmth and love. They were wide, almost too wide, reflecting the harsh light like glass. And then, a whisper. Hoarse, unfamiliar, but the voice was right. The boy's heart clenched. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to run forward, to embrace the person he had lost. But something inside him screamed at him to stay where he was. Then the figure moved, not slowly, not gently, but with a sharp, jerking motion, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. And suddenly, the boy knew. This wasn't right. This wasn't the person he had loved. Not anymore. The figure's lips curled, almost as if trying to smile, but it was wrong, too stiff, too forced. The boy stumbled backward, his mind racing. What had he done? What was in that vial? His grandmother had warned him, but he had been too blinded by grief to listen. The room felt colder now. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The figure on the table tilted its head, studying him. And then, very softly, it spoke. The words were broken, fragmented, like someone grasping for a memory long forgotten. The boy's hands clenched into fists as his throat tightened. The figure lifted a trembling hand, reaching toward him. Come, here. The boy couldn't move. His feet refused to listen, his breath caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The air felt wrong, thick with something unseen, something watching. Then, a noise from the hallway. A voice. Someone was coming. The boy's head snapped toward the door. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to do something, anything. But before he could move, the figure on the table turned sharply toward the sound. And then, it smiled. The boy's blood turned to ice. Because that smile, it wasn't theirs. It wasn't right. It wasn't human. And he finally understood. This wasn't a miracle. This was something else entirely. And it was just beginning. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. The figure on the table, his loved one, yet not, kept staring at the doorway, that unnatural smile stretching wider, almost as if it was waiting. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. A shiver ran down the boy's spine. He wanted to call out, to warn whoever was coming, but no words came. His throat was dry, locked in fear. Then the figure moved. Not in a normal way. It slid off the table in one swift motion, landing on the cold floor without a sound. The boy barely had time to react before it turned its head sharply toward him. The dim light flickered above, casting deep shadows across its face, making its expression unreadable. It took a step forward. The boy stumbled back, his small hands gripping the edge of the counter behind him. His mind raced. He had wanted this. He had wanted them back, but this wasn't them. This was something else entirely. The door to the morgue creaked open. A man in a white coat, a worker, maybe a doctor, stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Hello, his voice echoed, tired and uninterested. He was probably just making his usual rounds, unaware of the nightmare unfolding before him. The boy opened his mouth, ready to scream, to warn him to run. But before he called, the figure lunged. A blur of movement. The doctor barely had time to react before a cold, stiff hand clamped around his wrist. He gasped, stumbling backward, his eyes going wide. What the? The figure tightened its grip. The doctor's face twisted in confusion and horror as he struggled, trying to pry himself free. Let go, the boy watched, frozen in place. The person he had loved was gone, replaced by something that moved like a shadow, something that shouldn't be here. The doctor wrenched his arm free, stumbling back toward the door. His hand shot to his pocket, fumbling for something. A phone, maybe. His breath was fast, ragged. What is this? Whoa. The figure didn't let him finish. It moved fast, too fast, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. But then, the boy screamed. It wasn't a word, wasn't even a real sound, just a desperate, terrified cry that ripped through the morgue. The figure stopped. For a moment, the room was silent again, filled only with the boy's heavy breathing. The figure stood still, almost as if confused. Slowly, it turned its head back toward him. The boy's hands shook. Tears blurred his vision. Please, he whispered. Please, stop. Something flickered across the figure's face. A hesitation.
A brief moment where, just for a second, it almost looked like them again. The doctor took the chance. He bolted toward the door, slamming it open, disappearing into the hallway. The boy barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the figure, his heart pounding. It stared back at him, something shifting in its gaze. The wrongness was still there, but underneath it, something else. A struggle. The boy took a shaky step forward. You don't have to do this. His voice was small, pleading. Please, come back. The figure twitched. Its fingers curled into fists. It looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Then, a single tear rolled down its cheek. The boy gasped. His chest ached with something deeper than fear. He had done this. He had brought them back, but they weren't supposed to be here. The vial. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. 3 drops only. He hadn't understood before, but now he did. Some things weren't meant to return. Tears burned his eyes as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the tiny vial that still had a trace of the shimmering liquid left inside. He didn't know what would happen. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He took a deep breath and stepped closer. The figure trembled, its body rigid, as if caught between 2 worlds. I love you, the boy whispered. Then, with trembling hands, he tipped the vial, letting a single drop fall onto its skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath. The tightness in its body eased. The unnatural stiffness faded. Its eyes, which had once been filled with something dark and distant, softened. It looked at the boy one last time. And then, it was gone. Not in a dramatic way, not with a scream or a flash of light. Just gone, like a whisper fading into the wind. The boy stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where they had been. His heart ached, but the fear was gone. He had wanted a miracle. But sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that goodbye is final. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, more people coming. The boy wiped his face, slipping the empty vial into his pocket. He took one last look at the empty morgue table. And then, without another word, he walked away.